My name is Claire Whitmore. The day my life unraveled started with a velvet box and my husband's most convincing smile. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story, because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It was a Thursday morning, the kind where the sunlight slips through the blinds just right, turning the dust motes into tiny floating stars. I was in the kitchen pouring coffee when Daniel strolled in with that calculated casualness he always wore when he wanted something. "Close your eyes," he said. I laughed. "If it's a spider, I swear." "Not this time." He placed something small and weighty into my hands. I opened my eyes to see a black velvet jewelry box. Inside, nestled against the satin lining, was a silver pendant shaped like a key. At first glance, it was beautiful, intricate design, the kind of thing you'd see in a high-end store window. But when I looked closer, I noticed a small engraved number on the back. "What's the number for?" I asked, half smiling. He waved it off, his tone breezy. "Oh, just part of the design. You like it?" I nodded, even though something in my gut shifted. Daniel wasn't a man of spontaneous gestures. Every gift had a purpose, usually timed with something he needed from me, like a signature on a form, or my agreement to host a dinner he didn't want to organize. Still, I let him clasp it around my neck. "It suits you," he murmured. After breakfast, he mentioned casually, "I'm heading out tomorrow. Just a short business trip. Back in a week." A week, I frowned. His work consulting for small companies usually meant short meetings, not week-long absences. He shrugged. "Things come up. Don't worry about me." I tried to shake off the unease, but as I watched him leave the kitchen, I caught his reflection in the window. He wasn't smiling anymore. The next morning started like any other. I opened my little bookstore at 9 sharp, flipping the sign to open and breathing in that comforting scent of paper and coffee from the in-store cafe. By 10, I was helping a customer find an old copy of Rebecca when the bell over the door jingled. 3 men walked in, not customers. Their black jackets and clipped haircuts made my stomach knot instantly. Claire Whitmore, the tallest one, asked. "Yes, you're under arrest." The words felt like they belonged in someone else's story. The customers froze wide-eyed as the officer's voice echoed through the shop. For what I managed to say. The answer came when they pulled out a small evidence bag. Inside was the silver key pendant, the one Daniel had given me less than 24 hours ago. Only now the back was open, revealing a tiny compartment stuffed with micro SD cards. "Evidence tying you to a large-scale embezzlement scheme," the officer said flatly. "You have the right to remain silent." My pulse roared in my ears. "Wait, this isn't mine." They didn't care. Cold metal cuffs closed around my wrists. One of the customers gasped. Another whispered something I couldn't catch. They marched me out of the store, past the brick storefronts and cafe tables where people stopped mid-sip to stare. I caught my reflection in the bakery window, hair slightly mussed, mouth open in disbelief, the silver chain still dangling against my sweater. The interrogation room smelled faintly of bleach. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the one-way mirror. Finally, the door opened and Daniel walked in. For a moment, I felt a rush of relief until I saw his expression. Not frantic, not heartbroken. Calculated. He closed the door behind him and leaned forward. "Claire, listen to me. What is going on?" "They said I know what they said." He interrupted, his tone low but urgent. "And I need you to take the blame for this." I stared at him. "Excuse me." "It's the only way," he pressed on. "If I'm convicted, everything collapses, the house, the accounts, everything. But if you take the fall, you'll get a lighter sentence. I'll make sure you're taken care of. When you're out, I'll make it up to you." The words felt like ice water down my spine. "You're asking me to go to prison for you. I'm asking you to protect our life." He said it like it was noble, like I should be grateful to be the shield for his sins. I leaned back, my mind flashing through the years, the nights he'd been working late, the odd deposits in our bank account, the expensive watches that appeared without explanation. I'd always told myself he had secrets, but they were the harmless kind. Now I wasn't so sure. "You planted that necklace," I whispered. His jaw tightened. "It's complicated." "No, Daniel. It's not." He reached for my hand. I pulled it back. "Think about it," he said, standing. "It's either you or both of us go down." When he left, the room felt colder. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment I stopped being his wife and started becoming his enemy. The cell door clanged shut behind me with a sound that seemed to vibrate straight through my bones. They'd kept me overnight in a holding room, no pillow, no blanket, just a steel bench, and the steady hum of fluorescent lights that never turned off. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face in that interrogation room. Calm, rational, like a man asking his wife to pick up groceries, not to serve years in prison for him. Morning came, but the world didn't feel the same. The air tasted metallic. The guards' keys jingled like mockery. When they led me out for processing, my mind went to the one place it always did when I felt cornered: the bookstore. My sanctuary. I pictured the smell of the pages, the sound of the coffee machine, the way customers' voices softened when they walked between the shelves. And then I remembered the looks on their faces as I was cuffed and let out. By the time they took me to my arraignment, news had already spread. A local tabloid had posted my mugshot, hair limp, eyes wide and stunned, alongside a headline that screamed, "Bookstore owner tied to $1 million embezzlement scandal." They made it sound like I'd been laundering money behind the cash register, handing out novels with one hand and criminal transactions with the other. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor laid out the case against me in crisp, confident tones. The micro SD cards found inside the pendant contained spreadsheets, transaction records, and offshore account details. Every file linked to a shell company, one that, according to the registration papers, I owned. My lawyer, a weary-looking man named Barnes, leaned toward me. "It's bad," he whispered. "They've built quite the paper trail. If we can't break it, you're looking at years." "Daniel," I started. Barnes gave me a look I couldn't read. "He's not the one in handcuffs right now." During the recess, they allowed Daniel to approach me. He stood just far enough away to make it seem like we weren't conspiring. "You didn't answer me," he said quietly. I stared at him, my wrists still cuffed. "What's there to answer? You set me up." His eyes flicked toward the bailiff. "You're being dramatic. This is survival. If I go down, you'll lose everything anyway. At least this way one of us walks free." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that our marriage had been built on something I couldn't even name anymore, but my voice wouldn't come. When the judge read out the bail amount, it was higher than anything I could possibly pay: $200,000. The bookstore was worth maybe half that, and I knew Daniel wasn't going to use a cent of his money for me. I was escorted back to the detention center, the echo of the judge's gavel still ringing in my head. That evening, I was allowed one phone call. I dialed Daniel first, even though I already knew what the outcome would be. He picked up after the third ring. "Claire, they set bail, 200,000. He hesitated just long enough to confirm what I feared. "I can't," he said. "Everything's tied up right now." Tied up. That was Daniel's way of saying he wasn't willing. "Daniel, please," I whispered. My voice cracked, and I hated myself for it. "You'll be fine," he said. "Do what we talked about, and I'll take care of you later." And just like that, he hung up. The next morning, one of the guards brought me a folded piece of paper. "Came in with the mail," she said. It was a clipping from a society page printed in glossy color. Daniel was there wearing his best suit, standing next to a striking young woman in a crimson dress. The caption read, "Prominent businessman Daniel Whitmore attends charity gala with associate." The date was last night. I stared at the picture until my vision blurred. He wasn't just leaving me to rot, he was already living a life without me. That night, lying on the steel bench, I made myself a promise. If Daniel wanted me to be the one in prison, fine. But when I got out and I would get out, he was going to wish he'd never put that pendant around my neck. The next time I saw Daniel was 3 days later in a small, windowless room the detention center called the family meeting area. There was no warmth to it, just two metal chairs bolted to the floor and a table so scratched it looked like it had been clawed at for decades. He walked in wearing a charcoal suit that looked newly pressed. His hair was perfectly combed back, not a strand out of place. If anyone had walked in without context, they'd think he was here to negotiate a business deal, not to speak to the wife he'd just abandoned to a cell. I didn't stand when he came in. I didn't even greet him. I just watched him sit down with that self-assured air that had once charmed me. "I've been thinking about what I said." He began, his tone smooth, deliberate. "And I need you to really listen, Claire. No interruptions." I crossed my arms. "You mean the part where you asked me to throw away my life so you could keep yours?" He tilted his head as if my words were just noise. "It's not about throwing it away. It's about strategy. The authorities already believe you're the primary actor here. The shell company's in your name. The data was found in your possession. Because you put it there, I cut in." He sighed a little impatiently. "Details, Claire. The fact is, if you fight this, they'll dig deeper. And if they dig deep enough, they'll find me. That means both of us go down and we lose everything: the house, the accounts, our reputations, our reputations." I laughed, the sound brittle. "Mine's already ruined." He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "If you plead guilty, you'll get a reduced sentence. Maybe 2 years with good behavior. I'll be out here making sure everything's ready for you when you come home." I stared at him. "You really believe I'm stupid enough to trust you after this?" His jaw tightened, and I saw the flicker, the same one I'd seen when deals didn't go his way. His charm was a mask, and when it slipped, the man underneath was sharp and cold. "Claire," he said finally, "this isn't about trust. It's about survival. You love this life we've built. You think that bookstore is going to sustain you when you're 45, 50. I'm the one who gave us this lifestyle. Without me, you'd still be living in that cramped apartment over your aunt's garage." I felt my nails dig into my palms under the table. The worst part wasn't the insult. It was the way he said it, like my worth was measured entirely in what he had given me. "I built that bookstore?" I said, my voice low. "Every shelf, every event, every customer who kept coming back, that was me, not your money." He smirked, a slow, condescending curve of the lips. "And yet, here you are wearing a prison jumpsuit because you got caught holding my gift." That night, back in my cell, I lay awake replaying the conversation. For years, I'd ignored the little signs, the missing hours, the vague explanations, the way he'd sometimes disappear into his study, with his phone pressed to his ear and a look that said, "Not now." I'd told myself he was just busy, that I should be grateful we never had to worry about bills, that the trips we took and the clothes I wore were signs of his devotion. Now I saw the truth. I'd been living in the comfort of a house built on sand. The next morning, my lawyer Barnes came to see me. He looked even more tired than usual, his tie slightly crooked. "I've been reviewing your file," he said, dropping a thick folder onto the table. "The evidence is substantial. All of it points to you." "Because it's been planted," I said. He studied me for a long moment. "Do you have proof?" I swallowed hard. "No, not yet." "Then you need to decide if you want to fight this head-on, which will be long, expensive, and risky, or consider a plea." The prosecutors hinting they'd be open to one, 2 to 3 years, maybe less with parole. It was almost word for word what Daniel had said. "Barnes, do you think my husband is innocent?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I think your husband's been very careful." Later that day in the mess hall, I overheard two women talking at the next table. I wasn't listening, At first, the place was always filled with a dull hum of voices, but then I caught Daniel's name. Whitmore, one of them said. Yeah, I've seen him. Comes to those charity things with that girl in the red dress. Something hot and bitter surged in my chest. What girl? I asked, turning toward them. They exchanged a glance, then the taller one shrugged. Some blonde. 20-something maybe. Real arm candy type. He's been all over the society pages lately. It was confirmation of what I'd already suspected. Daniel wasn't just planning to replace me after I took the fall, he'd already started the audition process. That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to plead guilty. I wasn't going to take the fall. If Daniel wanted to survive at my expense, he was going to find out what it felt like when the person you counted on turned against you. But to do that, I needed proof. And from inside these walls, proof was hard to come by. I started small. I went over every conversation I'd had with Daniel in the past year, every unusual purchase, every trip he'd taken under vague pretenses. I wrote it all down in a notebook I'd bought from the commissary. Dates, names, places, even snippets of overheard phone calls from his study when he didn't know I was in the hallway. If there was a way to connect those dots, I'd find it. 2 days later, Opportunity walked in, wearing a navy cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses. Claire, the woman said, introducing herself as Marlene, one of the prison's counselors. She was middle-aged, with the kind of face that made you feel like you could tell her things. We talked about the usual adjustment stress routines. But when I mentioned in carefully vague terms that I'd been framed by my husband, she tilted her head and studied me. You know, she said slowly, I have a friend on the outside. A journalist. Investigative type. Sometimes she likes to poke into cases where something feels off. My pulse quickened. Do you think she'd be interested in mine? Marlene's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. If what you're telling me is true, she might just be. That night, I couldn't sleep. For the first time since the arrest, it wasn't because I felt trapped, it was because I felt the first flicker of hope. If I could get this journalist to dig where I couldn't, maybe Daniel's perfect image would start to crack. Maybe those micro SD cards weren't the only pieces of evidence out there, and maybe I could turn his strategy against him. Marlene didn't waste time. 2 days later, she appeared at the entrance of the common room, motioning for me to follow her. We walked down a quiet corridor past the laundry room and a locked storage closet until we reached her small, cluttered office. She's here, Marlene said, lowering her voice. Name's Jenna Price. She's not officially here as press, so keep it casual. If the administration knew she was digging, they'd shut it down before we even started. Sitting in the corner was a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes that didn't miss a thing. She wore a faded denim jacket over a black turtleneck, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. Claire, she said, standing to shake my hand. Her grip was firm, her gaze steady. Marlene tells me you've got a story. I sat across from her, feeling the weight of her attention. My husband framed me for embezzlement. The police found evidence in a necklace he gave me, evidence I didn't know existed. Her brows lifted slightly. That's bold. Most people would hide their involvement in that kind of thing, not plant it on someone else. Daniel doesn't care about bold. He cares about winning, I said. And he's very, very careful. Jenna pulled a small recorder from her pocket. Mind if I nodded. For the next hour, I told her everything: the sudden gift, the arrest in front of my customers, the visit in the interrogation room where Daniel asked me to take the blame, the photographs of him with the woman in the red dress. She didn't interrupt much, just asked the occasional precise question. You said the micro SD cards had financial data. Did you ever see Daniel working on anything like that at home? Yes. He'd lock himself in his study sometimes. I thought it was work calls. He kept a locked desk drawer. I never had a key. Did he ever have business partners over a few? Always the same two men. One called himself Victor. I don't know the other's name. Jenna leaned back, tapping her pen against her notepad. Okay, here's how we play this. I can't subpoena anything not without a case already open against him. But I can dig. I can track down his associates. Follow the money trails, maybe even talk to that girlfriend if she's willing to open her mouth. The sound of girlfriend in reference to Daniel made my stomach clench, but I forced myself to nod. And if you find something, then we take it to your lawyer. Or to the DA directly if your lawyer doesn't move fast enough. But Claire, she fixed me with a hard look. This is going to take time. And you have to keep your mouth shut in here. People sell information for favors. Over the next few weeks, I became a master of subtle communication. Marlene would accidentally drop off envelopes in my cell inside, were coded notes from Jenna. We'd agreed on a system. Certain phrases meant she'd found something promising, others meant a dead end. The first encouraging note came disguised in a letter about a fictional book club Victor RSVP'd, but brought a +1 who made quite the scene. That was our code for one of Daniel's associates has been located, and he's connected to the girlfriend. Meanwhile, in court, the prosecution kept pressing. My lawyer, Barnes, told me the plea deal was still on the table, his tone almost pleading now. "You're running out of time, Claire," he said. "The judge isn't going to keep delaying forever." I met his gaze, calm but firm. "No plea. Not until you see what I'm working on." He frowned. "Working on, you're in custody. Just trust me," I said, echoing the very words Daniel had thrown at me countless times. Only this time they were loaded with intent. 2 weeks later, Jenna sent me another coded message through Marlene. The garden party was full of snakes, but one of them left a trail. That meant she'd found a money path. When Marlene came to see me that evening, she looked almost giddy. She says it's an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Daniel's name isn't on it, but Victor's is, and the transfers match the dates of the alleged embezzlement. She's also got photos of Daniel and Victor meeting at a private marina. I felt the first real surge of hope in months. Can she connect the account to the shell company in my name? That's next on her list. Life inside didn't get easier, but it became more bearable now that I had purpose. Every time I saw Daniel in court, I kept my expression neutral. But inside, I was cataloging every smirk, every confident glance toward the prosecutor's table. He still thought I was cornered. Then came the day Barnes finally saw the preliminary packet from Jenna. He flipped through the document slowly, his brow furrowing. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. "A friend," I said. "This changes things. If we can get a forensic accountant to verify these transfers, we could petition the court for a review. But Claire, this is still circumstantial unless we can tie Daniel directly to the account." "That's the next step," I said, my voice steady. The very next coded note from Jenna hit like a thunderclap. "The key fits the lock." It meant she'd found a direct link, Daniel's signature on a hidden transfer to the Cayman account. I knew then that we had enough to turn the tide. When Barnes and I met the following morning, I slid the note across the table. "It's time." He exhaled, almost smiling for the first time since we'd met. "All right. I'll file the petition. Make sure Daniel sees every page," I said. In the next court session, Daniel walked in looking relaxed, his arm brushing against his high-priced attorney's. But as Barnes began to present the new evidence, I watched his jaw tighten, his posture stiffen. The photographs appeared, first him and Victor on the marina, hands clasped in a too-long handshake. Then the bank records showing the Cayman account. Then the pièce de résistance, the transfer form with his own signature. The courtroom buzzed. The judge banged her gavel for order. Daniel's attorney leaned in, speaking rapidly into his ear. For the first time, Daniel didn't look at me with smug superiority. He looked at me like he was trying to calculate the odds of surviving this. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. That night, back in my cell, I allowed myself a single whispered thought. This is only the beginning. Daniel had built an empire of lies, and I'd just found the first loose thread. I was going to pull until the whole thing unraveled, and when it did, I'd make sure he was standing right underneath the wreckage. When the judge adjourned for the day, Daniel didn't leave right away. He stood by the defense table, his lawyer speaking into his ear, but his eyes were locked on me. There was no smugness now, just calculation, like a chess player suddenly realizing his queen was exposed. The bailiff led me out before he could approach, but I felt his gaze following me all the way to the holding area. Back in the detention center, the air felt heavier. That courtroom moment had shifted something. For months, Daniel had been untouchable in my mind, the man who always stayed 10 steps ahead. Now I'd watched him falter. And faltering men are dangerous. 2 days later, Barnes came to see me. He didn't waste time with small talk. "He's rattled," he said. His lawyer filed a motion to suppress the evidence from Jenna's investigation, claiming it was obtained illegally. Can they do that? They can try, but we can argue that Jenna acted as a private citizen, not law enforcement, so the same restrictions don't apply. Still, it's a fight. And Daniel's attorney is very, very good. I leaned forward. So we keep pressing. Barnes nodded, but his expression was grim. "Claire, you should know something. Daniel's been talking to people, not just lawyers. Rumor is he's trying to get certain witnesses to adjust their stories. Witnesses, former employees of one of his companies. They could either help us or bury you, depending on what they say. And right now, he's doing everything he can to make sure it's the latter." That night, lying on my narrow cot, I thought about the witnesses. If Daniel was desperate enough to tamper with testimony, it meant he knew the walls were closing in. But it also meant he was leaving fingerprints all over his panic. I scribbled in my notebook names I remembered from company events, people I'd met once or twice, but who might have seen more than they let on. If Jenna could find even one person willing to talk, we could cut Daniel's influence to pieces. A week later, Marlene slipped into the common area and handed me another coded envelope. Inside was a single line from Jenna: "The red dress talks when the champagne flows." I read it twice before the meaning sank in. Daniel's new girlfriend, the one I'd seen in the charity photos, had been talking at an event, and Jenna had been there to listen. Marlene's lips twitched with a hint of satisfaction. Apparently, she's not as loyal as Daniel thinks. The next visit from Jenna confirmed it. "Her name's Kelsey," she said, sliding into the chair across from me in Marlene's office. 26, former marketing assistant at one of Daniel's subsidiaries. She thought she was dating a successful older man. Now she's starting to suspect she's just a pawn. "Did she tell you anything useful?" Jenna's eyes gleamed. "Plenty. She's seen him with Victor, overheard conversations about moving assets offshore. And get this, she was in the room when Daniel signed off on that transfer to the Cayman account. She didn't know what it was at the time, but now she remembers the date. It matches our records exactly." I felt my pulse quicken. Would she testify? She might. But she's scared. She knows Daniel has a mean streak, and she's convinced he could ruin her career if she crosses him. I sat back thinking. Then we need to make it worth her while. If she thinks she's protecting herself, she'll talk. Barnes was skeptical when I told him about Kelsey. Relying on the mistress of the accused isn't exactly a bulletproof strategy. "Neither is sitting here waiting for Daniel to finish destroying me," I said. After a long pause, he agreed to have an investigator contact her discreetly. While that played out, life inside continued its slow grind, but I noticed something. The guards had started giving me longer looks, and not the friendly kind. My cell was searched twice in 3 days. The second time, one of my letters from Jenna had been torn open, though it had clearly already been read. Someone wanted me to know I was being watched. I suspected Daniel. He'd always been good at sending messages without speaking a word. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later. Barnes walked into the meeting room with a folder so thick it made my chest tighten with anticipation. "Kelsey talked," he said. "We've got her statement signed. She's willing to testify that she saw Daniel handle the very evidence he claimed you planted the micro SD cards, and that she overheard him telling Victor they'd be safe with Claire." The words hit me like a jolt. Daniel hadn't just framed me, he'd literally discussed it in front of someone he thought was too naive to understand. Barnes tapped the folder. With this, plus the financial records, we can file a motion to have your charges dropped. It won't be instant, the DA will fight it, but this is strong. For the first time since my arrest, I felt the bars around me loosen, if only in my mind. The next court date was different. When I entered, the energy was charged, like everyone sensed something was about to shift. Daniel sat at the defense table, but his posture was tighter, his jaw set. Barnes laid out the new evidence piece by piece: Kelsey's statement, the corroborating dates from Jenna's records, the offshore transactions. The prosecutor's side grew quieter with each exhibit. When Barnes read aloud Daniel's own words, "They'll be safe with Claire," I watched Daniel's face harden, his eyes narrowing, like a man realizing his escape routes were dwindling. The judge didn't make a ruling that day, but she did grant a recess to allow for further examination of the new evidence. Translation: Daniel was in trouble. That evening, Marlene found me in the corridor. "Jenna says to be careful," she murmured. "Kelsey's been getting strange phone calls. And someone tried to break into her apartment last night." I froze. "Do you think I think Daniel's not above intimidation?" Marlene said. "And I think you need to be ready for him to come at you in ways the court can't control." Lying on my cot that night, I thought about the man I'd married, how he'd once been charming enough to make me believe we were a team. Now he was a cornered animal, and cornered animals bite. But I also thought about something else. Every move he made to protect himself was another move that proved his guilt. And I was done playing by his rules. I didn't sleep much that night. Marlene's warning about Kelsey replayed in my head in an endless loop. A break-in attempt wasn't just intimidation, it was Daniel sending a message: I can reach anyone, anywhere. In the dim light of early morning, I sat on my cot with my knees drawn up, staring at the tiny rectangle of sky visible through the narrow window. I had been waiting for Daniel to make a mistake, but now I realized something important he already had. He'd underestimated both of us. Me because he thought I would fold under pressure, and Kelsey because he assumed she would never turn against him. By breakfast, I'd made a decision: I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to make Daniel regret every calculated betrayal. When Barnes visited that afternoon, I told him about the break-in attempt. His expression darkened. "That's witness tampering," he said. "If we can prove it was connected to Daniel, it's another nail in his coffin." "How do we prove it?" I asked. He rubbed his chin. "We need something: direct phone records, an admission from whoever did it, or surveillance footage. Jenna's good at digging, but she's not law enforcement. If she tries too hard, she could compromise the case." That was when an idea began to take root. Dangerous, but promising. Barnes? What if Daniel thought Kelsey was starting to have second thoughts about testifying? What if he tried to reassure her and in doing so slipped up? Barnes frowned. "You're talking about a sting." "Something like that," I said. "Kelsey could call him, make it seem like she's scared. If he says anything to confirm he was behind the break-in, it's on record." 2 days later, Jenna confirmed that Kelsey was willing. "She's nervous, but she's angrier than she is scared right now," Jenna told me during her visit. "And she wants to see him pay." They set up the call in a safe location with law enforcement listening in. I wasn't there, but later, Barnes relayed every word. Kelsey's voice trembled convincingly as she told Daniel about the break-in. Daniel, smooth as ever, pretended to be concerned. But then he said it. "Don't worry. That was just to make sure you're staying loyal. You're fine as long as you keep your mouth shut." The moment those words left his mouth, the trap snapped shut. The next court date was electric. Barnes presented the audio recording first thing, letting the judge and jury hear Daniel's voice in crisp clarity. The gasp from the gallery was audible. Daniel's lawyer objected furiously, but the judge overruled the recording was legally obtained with Kelsey's consent. For the first time, Daniel's confidence cracked in public. He shifted in his seat, his mouth tightening, as Barnes detailed the chain of intimidation and tampering. The prosecutor, who had been stone-faced toward me for months, began to look at Daniel differently, like he was the real quarry now. After the session ended, I was led back toward the holding cells. As we passed the hallway near the defense rooms, Daniel appeared at the other end. The bailiff was between us, but his eyes locked onto mine. "You think this changes anything?" He said, his voice low, but carrying. I stopped. "It changes everything." His smile was thin, brittle. "You don't know what I'm capable of." I held his gaze steady. "No, Daniel. I know exactly what you're capable of, and that's why you're going to lose." The bailiff pushed me forward, but I kept my head high. That brief exchange had told me something important. Daniel was scared. And fear makes people sloppy. Back in the detention center, I was starting to sense a shift among the inmates. Whispers followed me in the hallways, not the accusatory kind from the early days, but something closer to respect. In here, winning against someone like Daniel, even just in the courtroom, was a victory, people noticed. Marlene noticed too. "You're not the same woman who came in here," she said one evening. I shrugged, though a part of me knew she was right. I guess being betrayed strips away whatever's left of who you used to be. Or it reveals who you really are, she said quietly. The next blow to Daniel came faster than I expected. Jenna had been tracing money transfers not just to the Cayman account, but to a second offshore account in Belize. This one was sloppier, more direct links to Daniel, fewer layers of obfuscation. She brought the records to Barnes, who wasted no time filing them with the court. Suddenly, the DA was requesting a re-examination of all charges against me in light of the new evidence. It was the first official acknowledgement from the state that maybe, just maybe, they'd been prosecuting the wrong person. But Daniel wasn't done playing dirty. 2 days later, Barnes arrived with a grim expression. "Someone's been leaking rumors to the press," he said. "Stories about you and this journalist implying you fabricated evidence to get out of prison." I felt my jaw clench. That's him. Trying to discredit everything before it sticks. Exactly. Which means we need to go on the offensive. The DA's office is already sniffing around him. We just need to give them reason to sink their teeth in. That night, I lay awake mapping out every possible move. I realized that all along Daniel had been banking on my passivity, on the idea that once I was locked away, my world would shrink to the size of this cell. But he'd miscalculated. My world had grown. I had allies. I had a journalist who saw through him, a witness who was willing to risk everything, and a lawyer who was starting to believe in my innocence. Most importantly, I had something Daniel didn't, nothing left to lose. When the next court session began, Barnes didn't just present new financial evidence. He asked the court to consider adding witness intimidation, perjury, and obstruction of justice to Daniel's growing list of potential charges. Daniel's lawyer tried to paint it all as a coordinated smear campaign, but the judge was unmoved. "These allegations will be reviewed with due seriousness," she said. For the first time, I saw Daniel look cornered. And it was a sight I'd been waiting for since the day he'd handed me that velvet box. As I was led out of the courtroom, I caught Jenna's eye in the gallery. She gave me the smallest nod, a silent promise that this wasn't over. And I knew she was right. The tide had shifted, but the real storm was still coming. The next morning, the detention center's communal TV was tuned to a local news station. I didn't usually pay attention. Most coverage was either sanitized fluff or depressing crime updates, but the anchor's voice made me look up. In a shocking turn of events, new evidence has emerged in the high-profile embezzlement case involving business consultant Daniel Whitmore and his wife Claire. Sources allege Mr. Whitmore may be under investigation for multiple financial crimes, including witness tampering. They showed a photo of Daniel leaving the courthouse the day before, surrounded by cameras, his jaw clenched, and sunglasses hiding his eyes. For months, the media had parroted his side of the story, the devoted husband blindsided by his wife's betrayal. Now the narrative was cracking, and the public could smell blood. A few inmates glanced at me, some nodding as if to say, "It's about time." By the time Barnes visited later that afternoon, the air around him practically hummed with energy. He didn't bother sitting before speaking. "The DA is officially reviewing your case. Off the record, one of their assistants told me they're leaning toward dropping the charges against you if the new evidence holds up. My chest tightened. I didn't dare let myself believe it just yet. And Daniel. They're not ready to arrest him. But they're digging. Hard. Jenna's info gave them the keys, and now they're unlocking doors we didn't even know existed. I thought about Daniel probably pacing in his glass-walled office trying to spin the narrative in his favor. But for the first time, the story wasn't his to control. That night, Marlene came to see me in my cell. She sat on the edge of my cot like we were two friends catching up. "You know he's going to try something," she said quietly. "He's already tried everything," I replied. "No." She shook her head. "He's been on the defensive. But when he feels the loss coming for real, that's when he'll lash out. You need to be ready for that." Her words stayed with me long after she left. Sure enough, the very next day, Barnes showed up looking troubled. "Kelsey's been getting threats again," he said. "Notes under her door, anonymous calls, someone following her car. We've informed the police, but she's terrified." My fists clenched at my sides. That's Daniel's desperation showing. Barnes nodded grimly. "But it also means he's not as in control as he wants everyone to believe. Men like him. They only resort to blunt intimidation when they feel the walls closing in." 3 days later, the DA summoned Barnes and me to a pre-hearing meeting. It was the first time I'd been in a room with someone from their office who wasn't actively trying to put me away. The assistant DA, a woman named Herrera, spread out the files on the table. "We're inclined to dismiss the charges against you, Mrs. Whitmore. The offshore account evidence and the recorded witness intimidation make it clear you've been wrongly implicated." Relief flooded me, but Herrera wasn't finished. "That said, we need your cooperation moving forward. If we proceed against Mr. Whitmore, we'll need your testimony not just about the framing, but about his business dealings, his habits, anything that paints a complete picture." The words came easily. "You'll have it." Leaving that meeting, I felt like a different person than the one who'd been hauled out of her bookstore in handcuffs months ago. I wasn't just fighting to clear my name anymore. I was part of the hunt. Daniel must have caught wind of the DA's decision because 2 nights later, the detention center's night guard came to my cell with a message. "You've got a visitor." It wasn't visiting hours. I followed him to the small interview room, every nerve on alert. Daniel was already there, sitting with his hands folded on the table, looking calmer than I expected. The guard stayed just inside the doorway, close enough to hear every word. "You've made quite the mess," Daniel said without preamble. "I'm cleaning up yours?" I shot back. His smile was faint, humorless. "Do you think they'll keep you around once they're done with me? You're useful now, but later, you'll be nothing but the woman who used her husband to save herself." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze without flinching. Better than being the man who sacrificed his wife to save his own skin. For the first time, he looked away. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I saw it, a crack in the facade. "You're not going to win, Claire," he said finally. "I already am." The guard stepped forward. "Time's up." As I was let out, I realized something important. Daniel had needed to see me, to measure me. And in doing so, he'd shown me he was rattled enough to break his own patterns. The hearing to dismiss my charges was set for the following week. Jenna and Kelsey were both there, sitting quietly in the gallery. Herrera laid out the case, succinctly detailing the evidence of Daniel's involvement and my absence from any legitimate link to the crimes. When the judge banged her gavel and said "case dismissed," the air seemed to rush out of my lungs. I was free. But as I stepped out into the sunlight for the first time in months, I didn't feel the urge to run or shout. My freedom wasn't the end of this story, it was the start of Daniel's. Because I knew what was coming next: indictments, subpoenas, and a public unraveling he couldn't spin his way out of. That night, I stayed at a friend's apartment. The bookstore was gone, sold off to cover legal costs, but my friend's guest room was clean and quiet. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking of every moment since that morning when Daniel handed me the pendant. He'd taken my freedom, my business, and months of my life. Now I was going to take something from him that he valued even more, his untouchable image. The next morning, I called Herrera. "Whatever you need against him," I said. "Names, dates, receipts, I'll give you everything." There was a pause on the other end before she said, "Then let's finish what we started." Freedom didn't feel like I thought it would. There was no cinematic swell of music, no triumphant sprint into the open air. Instead, it was strange, quiet, almost weightless. After months of clanging doors and fluorescent lights, the outside world felt too big, too bright. Jenna drove me from the courthouse. We didn't talk much at first. She seemed to understand I needed to absorb the moment. The hum of the engine, the rhythm of the road, the smell of coffee from her cup holder. These tiny, ordinary details hit me harder than I expected. Finally, she glanced over. "You ready to work?" That was Jenna. No congratulations, no sentimentality. Straight to the point. I nodded. More than ready. We spent the next few days in a cramped corner of her apartment, which doubled as her office. Papers were stacked on every surface, corkboards covered in photos, and red string lining the walls like a detective movie set. "This," she said, pointing to the main board, "is Daniel's web. Companies, shell corporations, offshore accounts, business partners. Some of these are legit. Most aren't. The DA is already looking at the Caymans and Belize accounts, but that's just the surface." I stepped closer. "What's the rest?" Jenna tapped a series of names. "These are his enablers. Accountants, lawyers, mid-level execs who made sure the paperwork was clean enough to keep him safe. If we can get one of them to talk, we can blow open the whole structure. And you think they'll turn on him?" She smirked. "Everyone turns on everyone when the stakes get high enough." Herrera called later that week. "We've got subpoenas going out, but Daniel's moving fast. He's shifting assets again, trying to put them in places we can't touch. We need proof of intent to obstruct. I knew Daniel's patterns better than anyone. He's going to use Victor. That's who he trusts when things get ugly." Jenna was already pulling up Victor's file. "We've got eyes on him. If he meets Daniel, we'll know." 3 days later, the call came in. Surveillance had caught Daniel and Victor entering a private club known for off-the-record deals. Jenna and I pored over the blurry stills, Daniel leaning in, Victor sliding a slim folder across the table. "Whatever's in that folder," Jenna said, "is worth risking being seen together." Herrera agreed. The DA's team moved to get a warrant for the club's security footage. Daniel might have thought the place was discreet, but these days, even discretion came with cameras. While the legal machine churned, I focused on my own contribution memory. I spent hours with Herrera's team recounting every suspicious transaction, every unexplained trip, every meeting Daniel had taken in the months before my arrest. It was exhausting dredging up details I'd half buried just to stay sane, but I knew every scrap mattered. One night, as I sat in Jenna's apartment with a cup of tea gone cold, I realized something: Daniel had relied on me for more than just a convenient fall guy. I'd been part of his camouflage. The respectable wife, the harmless bookstore owner, I'd been the reason no one looked too closely at him for years. Now I was the reason they were tearing everything apart. The first real crack came when one of Daniel's accountants agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. His statement linked Daniel directly to multiple fraudulent transactions and even implicated him in creating the shell company in my name. Herrera's voice was almost gleeful when she called me. "This is gold. Combined with Kelsey's testimony, it paints a picture even his lawyers will have trouble dismantling." But Daniel didn't just sit back. The next morning, a smear piece hit one of the business blogs portraying me as a bitter ex-wife out for revenge. It twisted my release into a technicality and claimed Daniel was the victim of a media witch hunt. Jenna slammed her laptop shut when she read it. Classic move. When you can't kill the evidence, kill the credibility of the person presenting it. I didn't take the bait. Let him talk. The truth is louder. We met with Herrera in person the next day. She laid out the plan. "We're close to having enough for an indictment. But I want more than that. I want a conviction. That means we don't just prove he committed these crimes. We prove he did so knowingly with intent to frame you as the fall guy. I leaned forward. Then let's prove it. The break came sooner than expected. Surveillance on Victor caught him leaving a storage unit in the middle of the night. The DA's team obtained a warrant and found boxes of files unshredded, untouched, like they'd been waiting for a rainy day. Inside were transaction records, internal memos, and unbelievably drafts of correspondence between Daniel and his lawyer discussing ensuring Claire remains the primary subject of the investigation. It was the smoking gun. When Herrera showed me the file, my hands actually shook. Months of fear, anger, and exhaustion coiled into a single moment of clarity. "This is it," I whispered. Herrera nodded. "With this, we can move." The day the indictment was announced, Daniel's arrest made the evening news. The footage was surreal: him in a tailored suit, hands cuffed in front, being guided into a black sedan by federal agents. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted his name, but he didn't look at them. He kept his head down the way he'd never done in court. Jenna poured 2 glasses of wine in her kitchen that night. "To poetic justice," she said. I raised my glass. "To survival, and then some." But even as I toasted, I knew this wasn't over. Daniel had resources, lawyers, and an ego that wouldn't allow him to admit defeat easily. Still, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting to him. I was ahead. And I intended to stay there until the gavel came down on the last chapter of his freedom. Daniel's trial began on a Monday morning in early spring. The courthouse was buzzing long before the first gavel struck. Reporters crowded the steps, their voices overlapping as camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts. From the window of the witness waiting room, I could see him arrive, flanked by his attorneys, wearing a navy suit and a tie I'd given him years ago for his birthday. The gift felt like a relic now, a reminder of how easily sentiment could be weaponized. Inside the courtroom, the air was taut with anticipation. The DA's team moved with quiet confidence, stacking files and organizing exhibits. Daniel sat at the defense table, posture perfect, jaw tight, the picture of composure for anyone who didn't know him. But I knew him. The stillness was a mask. The prosecution opened with the evidence from the storage unit, the memos, the transactions, and the damning correspondence, detailing his plan to ensure I became the primary subject of the investigation. As the words were read aloud, a low murmur rippled through the gallery. The jurors leaned forward, pens scratching across notepads. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't glance my way. But his hand resting on the table curled into a fist, just once, small, but enough for me to see. When it was my turn to testify, the bailiff led me to the stand. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady as I swore the oath. Herrera approached first. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you describe the events leading up to your arrest?" I told them everything. The pendant, the morning at the bookstore, the moment the police pulled out the micro SD cards. I described the meeting in the interrogation room, Daniel's request that I take the blame to save our life together. "Did you believe at that time that your husband was guilty of the crimes in question?" I hesitated only long enough to look directly at Daniel. "No, not then. I believed he was my husband, and that meant I could trust him." I was wrong. Then came the defense's turn. Daniel's attorney, a man named Calloway, approached with a faint smirk. "Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it true that you benefited financially from Mr. Whitmore's businesses during your marriage? I benefited from our shared income." "Yes," I replied evenly. "And isn't it also true that you had access to certain accounts, including the one tied to the embezzlement charges?" I met his gaze. "Access does not equal guilt. My name was on those accounts because Daniel put it there the same way he put my name on the shell company without my knowledge." Calloway's smirk faltered. "So you claim you had no idea where your husband's money was coming from?" "I claim I had no idea my husband was a criminal." I said, my voice sharper now. When my testimony ended, I stepped down from the stand, but not before glancing at Daniel. For the first time in months, his eyes met mine. There was no charm, No pleading, no pretense, only a cold recognition that I was no longer the woman he could control. The trial stretched over weeks. Witnesses came and went, Kelsey nervous but resolute, Victor trying to dodge questions until the threat of perjury forced him to answer, the accountant who'd cut a deal to testify. Piece by piece, the prosecution dismantled Daniel's image. The media devoured it, running nightly segments with headlines like "From Businessman to Betrayer" and "The Wife Who Fought Back." One afternoon, Jenna slid into the seat beside me in the gallery during a recess. "He's cornered," she whispered. "His lawyer's been floating plea deals to the DA. That's not the move of a man who thinks he can win." I nodded, but I didn't relax. Daniel wasn't the type to surrender without extracting something in return. Sure enough, 2 days later, Herrera pulled me aside. "He's willing to plead guilty to lesser charges if we agree to drop the witness intimidation count. That would cut his sentence significantly." I didn't hesitate. "No deal." Herrera studied me. "You're sure this could drag on?" "I'm sure. He didn't offer me mercy. He doesn't get any from me." The turning point came with the club security footage. Grainy but clear enough, it showed Daniel and Victor exchanging that slim folder. A handwriting expert confirmed the notes inside were Daniel's. When the footage played, Daniel's mask cracked. For the briefest moment, a flash of irritation, a tightening of his jaw. The jurors noticed. I could tell by the way they shifted in their seats, some glancing at him before looking back at the screen. Closing arguments were a study in contrasts. The defense painted Daniel as a man undone by a vindictive spouse and overzealous prosecutors. The prosecution painted him as a manipulative opportunist who'd used his wife as a shield only to discard her when she was no longer useful. Herrera's final words stayed with me. Claire Whitmore did not walk into that courtroom today to destroy her husband. She walked in to tell the truth. And the truth is, Daniel Whitmore built his empire on lies, and when it began to crumble, he tried to bury her under the rubble. When the jury filed out to deliberate, the air in the courtroom felt thick enough to cut. Hours passed. I stayed in the waiting room, Jenna beside me, saying nothing. Finally, the bailiff appeared. "They've reached a verdict." The jury foreperson stood reading the words I'd been waiting months to hear: guilty on all counts. Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. But when they led him away in cuffs, I thought I saw his shoulders sink just slightly, as though the weight he'd carried for so long had finally settled in full. Outside, cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in my face. Someone shouted, "Claire, how do you feel?" I paused, choosing my words carefully, free, and ready to start over. It was the truth. But it was also a warning. Because Daniel's conviction might have ended this chapter, but I knew starting over meant more than just walking away from his shadow. It meant reclaiming the life he'd tried to erase. The courthouse steps were chaos, flashing cameras, shouting reporters, the steady press of bodies trying to get closer. I kept my head high, letting the noise wash over me without stopping to answer any more questions. Herrera and her team formed a loose shield around me until we reached Jenna's car. Once the door closed, the sudden quiet was jarring. Jenna started the engine but didn't pull away immediately. She glanced over, her usual sharp gaze softened. "You know you don't have to be strong right now, right?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. If I stop being strong now, I don't know if I'll be able to start again. She didn't push. The next few days felt unreal. The media frenzy was relentless. My face was on the news almost as often as Daniel's, sometimes in sympathetic profiles, other times as a footnote to his downfall. Strangers stopped me in the street to say they admired me. Others whispered as I passed, their eyes lingering a little too long. Freedom was complicated. Herrera called on the third morning after the verdict. "Sentencing is scheduled for next month," she said. "We'll push for the maximum 15 years, no parole. Given the scope of his crimes, I think we'll get it." "Good," I said. My voice was calm, but inside I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Satisfaction, yes, but also emptiness. The fight had consumed me for so long that I wasn't sure what to do now that it was over. Jenna suggested I come with her to a small cafe downtown, one that didn't attract the kind of crowd likely to recognize me from the evening news. Over black coffee and a croissant, she slid a folder across the table. "What's this?" I asked. "Your next move." Inside were property listings, small commercial spaces all within the city. "I know the bookstore was your place. If you want it back or something like it, now's the time. The sympathy factor's high, and you'd be surprised how many people would want to support you." I ran my fingers over the pages. "It's not just about selling books anymore." "No," she said. "It's about telling your story on your own terms." That night, I lay awake in the guest room at my friend's apartment thinking about the last few years of my life. The bookstore had been more than a business, it had been my refuge, the one place untouched by Daniel's world. Until it wasn't. Maybe Jenna was right. Maybe rebuilding it wasn't just about having a livelihood again. Maybe it was about reclaiming something Daniel had stolen that had nothing to do with money. A week later, I met with Herrera again. She wanted to prepare me for sentencing day. "Daniel will probably try to speak," she said. "He might apologize. He might justify, 'Don't let it get to you.' He's not talking to you. He's talking to the record, to the judge, to anyone who might one day grant him a favor." "I know," I said. "He lost the right to get to me a long time ago." Still, part of me couldn't help wondering what he would say. Daniel wasn't a man who liked to lose in public. In the meantime, I visited one of the storefronts from Jenna's folder, a narrow space with high ceilings, exposed brick, and a big front window that let in the afternoon sun. It smelled faintly of old wood and dust, and the floorboards creaked under my steps. I could already picture shelves lining the walls, a small reading nook in the corner, maybe even a tiny cafe counter. A place that wasn't just a store but a sanctuary for me and for anyone who walked through the door. I didn't sign anything that day, but I knew I'd be back. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom felt different from the trial. Quieter, heavier. The jury was gone, replaced by a small audience of reporters, a few curious onlookers, and people from both sides of the case. Daniel was led in wearing the same suit he'd worn on the first day of trial, though it hung a little looser on him now. He looked straight ahead, not at me. Herrera spoke first, outlining the scope of his crimes and the damage he'd caused to investors, to employees, to me. Then Daniel stood. "I regret the pain this has caused." He began, his voice steady. "Not just to my wife, but to everyone involved. Mistakes were made. But I was not the villain this court has made me out to be." I almost laughed. Even now, he couldn't help rewriting the story to suit himself. The judge listened without expression, then delivered the sentence: 15 years, no possibility of parole. Daniel didn't react. He simply sat down as if absorbing the number in silence. When the bailiff led him away, he didn't look back. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Herrera asked if I felt closure. "Closure isn't the right word," I said, "but it's something." 2 weeks later, I signed the lease for the little brick front space. The first day I had the keys, I stood in the middle of the empty floor and breathed in the scent of dust and sunlight. It wasn't just about rebuilding a business. It was about proving to myself that I could build something again, something that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in years, I felt like my life was mine again. The keys were cold in my palm, heavier than I expected. I turned them over as I stood outside the little brick front shop, the for lease sign now hanging crooked in the window. The street was quiet that morning, just the hum of distant traffic and the sound of a shopkeeper rolling up a metal shutter 2 doors down. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of plaster and dust, but the sunlight pouring through the front window softened it. I ran my hand along the bare wall where shelves would go. For months, my world had been concrete walls and steel doors. Now I had space, freedom, possibility. I'd decided the store wouldn't just be a bookstore this time. It would be a place where people could gather, read, and feel safe, the kind of place I once needed myself. The first few days were a blur of planning. I sketched floor layouts on scraps of paper, made calls to suppliers, and even reconnected with a few former customers who'd reached out after seeing the news coverage. One afternoon, a woman named Teresa came by. She'd been a regular at my old store, always ordered poetry collections. She held my hand for a long moment. "I'm glad you're back," she said simply. That meant more than I expected. Still, not every face that appeared in the doorway brought comfort. On the third day, as I was sweeping near the counter, I looked up to see a man leaning in the open doorway. Tall, sharp-featured, expensive coat. I didn't recognize him at first, but then he spoke. "You're hard to miss these days, Mrs. Whitmore." The way he said my name, slow, deliberate, made the hairs on my arms rise. "Do I know you?" I asked. "I was a friend of Daniel's. Business associate." He smiled faintly as if we shared some private joke. "Thought I'd stop by. See how you're rebuilding." Every instinct told me this wasn't a friendly visit. "I'm busy," I said, moving toward the counter. "Of course." He lingered a second longer, his eyes scanning the empty space before turning to leave. When the door shut, I stood still for a moment, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade. I didn't know what he'd really wanted, but I had a feeling he'd be back. Or someone like him. That night, I called Jenna. Someone came by. Said he was a friend of Daniel's. Her tone sharpened instantly. Name, I gave her a description, but no name. She swore softly. "I'll dig." Could be nothing. Could be someone sniffing around to see if you're going to cause more trouble for his circle. "I'm not done with Daniel's circle," I said. "I know," she replied. "But they don't need to know that yet." The next week, construction started. The sound of hammers and the scent of sawdust filled the air. I spent hours with the contractor arguing over counter heights and lighting angles. It felt good not just making decisions, but making them for myself. But the past had a way of creeping in. One afternoon, while I was measuring a wall for shelving, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Claire," a familiar voice said. I froze. "Daniel, I hear you've been busy," he said. His tone was smooth, but under it I heard the faint strain. "Opening a new shop. Moving on fast." "I'm not calling you to talk about my life," I said. "You lost the right to comment on it." He chuckled softly. "Just remember, we shared a lot of years. A lot of information. Be careful what you stir up." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, the tape measure hanging limp in my hand. When I told Jenna, she wasn't surprised. "He's in prison, Claire. Calls like that are how he tries to remind you he still exists." "I know," I said. "But he's not wrong about one thing: we did share a lot of years. And I remember more than he thinks." The store took shape piece by piece. Shelves went up, the counter was built, a small cafe nook was installed. I decided to call it Second Chapter, a quiet nod to the life I was building now. On opening day, the place was full. Old customers, curious neighbors, even a few strangers who'd read my story and wanted to support me. Teresa came back for her poetry books. For a few hours, I let myself just be the shop owner again, greeting people, ringing up sales, recommending novels. But as I stood at the register, I saw him again. The man in the expensive coat. This time, he didn't come inside. He stood across the street watching through the window. I met his gaze and didn't look away. After a moment, he turned and walked off. I didn't know what message he was trying to send, but I knew this much. I wasn't the same woman Daniel had left in handcuffs. If they came for me now, they'd find someone ready. The man in the expensive coat didn't come back for nearly a week. But his absence didn't feel like relief. It felt like the air just before a storm. I caught myself glancing at the front window too often, wondering if I'd see him standing across the street again. On the seventh day, he returned. This time, he came inside. The bell over the door jingled softly, and for a moment the sounds of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine in the cafe corner seemed to dull. "Nice place," he said, walking the length of the store slowly, his fingertips brushing the spines of books. Cleaner than Daniel's version of business. I kept my voice neutral. If you have a point, make it. He turned toward me, the faintest smile curling his mouth. I do. Daniel may be locked away, but his friends aren't. And some of them, they're nervous. You see, he kept records. A lot of records. The kind that could hurt people if they ever left his hands. I didn't respond. He leaned a little closer. There's a file. One he made sure no one could touch but him. If it surfaces, it could burn more than just him. Some people think you might know where it is. I don't, I said flatly. Maybe not, he allowed. But if you did, it'd be worth a lot. Enough to make trouble disappear. He left before I could reply, his words lingering like smoke. That night, I called Jenna. You think he's fishing? She asked. Definitely. But if what he's saying is true and there is a file, it could be leverage, she finished. I hesitated. Or it could be a trap. Something Daniel planted to pull me back in. Claire, if this file exists and it's damaging enough, you're not the only one looking for it. His network would want to bury it. The DA would want to use it, and Daniel might be counting on it to bargain for a reduced sentence. I knew she was right. But the thought of digging into Daniel's shadows again made my stomach knot. 2 days later, I got a letter. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, the handwriting neat and unfamiliar. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words: check the lake house. My hands tightened on the page. Daniel's lake house wasn't really a house, more like a remote retreat. We'd used a handful of times for weekends away. Isolated, quiet, and now that I thought about it, perfect for hiding something. I hadn't been there since before my arrest. Legally, half of it was still mine. Jenna insisted on coming with me. If you think I'm letting you poke around an empty property tied to Daniel Whitmore alone, you're crazier than I thought. We drove out early in the morning. The lake house was exactly as I remembered, cedar siding weathered to silver big windows facing the water, the faint smell of pine in the air. But inside, it felt different. Cold, abandoned. We started in the study, Daniel's preferred space. The desk drawers were mostly empty, but one stuck halfway when I tried to open it. Jenna crouched down and shone a flashlight inside. There's something wedged at the back, she said. With a little effort, we pulled out a flat metal box locked with a combination. Think this is it? I asked. Jenna grinned. Only one way to find out. Back at her apartment, she worked the lock with patient precision until it clicked open. Inside were files, thick manila folders stuffed with papers, USB drives, and a small leather-bound notebook. The papers were a mix of financial records, correspondence, and notes in Daniel's handwriting. It was all incriminating: offshore transfers, bribes, lists of allies, and liabilities. And then there was the notebook. Inside, in Daniel's tight script, was a running log of meetings, payments, and my name. Over and over in contexts that made my blood run cold. Claire present for cover. Claire unaware, maintain ignorance. If necessary, Claire to absorb blame. It was the entire blueprint of how he'd planned to use me. This is it, Jenna said quietly. This is the file. And now what I asked. That's your choice. Turn it over to the DA and it nails more than just Daniel. Or keep it and you've got leverage for the rest of your life. I stared at the pages. They felt heavy in my hands, not just with paper, but with years of lies. I didn't decide right away. I kept the box hidden in my apartment, checking the locks twice before I left for the store each morning. But I could feel the tension building. The man in the expensive coat hadn't come back. But I knew he'd heard I'd been to the lake house. One evening, as I was closing up second chapter, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Its engine-idled windows tinted too dark to see inside. When I stepped outside, it drove away without headlights. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the box, about the names in it, about how many of those people might be willing to do anything to make it disappear. I realized then that keeping it wasn't leverage. It was a target. The next morning, I called Herrera. "I have something you need to see," I told her. And for the first time since Daniel's conviction, I felt the strange, fierce satisfaction of knowing I was about to close the last open wound he'd left in my life. I met Herrera at her downtown office early the next morning. The metal box felt heavier than ever in my arms, though I knew its weight had nothing to do with the steel casing. It was the kind of weight you carried in your chest, years of betrayal lies, and a truth that could still ruin lives. Herrera cleared a space on her desk, her expression unreadable. "Is this what I think it is?" I set it down and flipped open the lid. The faint metallic scent of the box mingled with the paper smell from the files inside. She sifted through the folders, her eyes narrowing as she read. Financial records, offshore transfers, payments to intermediaries. She paused at the leather-bound notebook. "And this?" She flipped to a page with my name on it, her brows lifting. "He documented the entire frame job in his own handwriting. That's his voice on paper." I said my own voice, steady. Every step he took to make me the fall guy. Herrera closed the notebook carefully, almost like it was evidence from a crime scene, which of course it was. "This changes everything." By the end of the day, the DA's office had moved fast. Search warrants were being drawn up for the homes and offices of several people mentioned in the files. Quiet inquiries went out to federal agencies, the kind that never made the news until they were ready to strike. Herrera pulled me aside before I left. "Claire, once this gets moving, you might be contacted by some of these people directly or indirectly. They may try to scare you into silence, or they may try to bargain. Don't engage. Let us handle it." I nodded, but I couldn't help thinking of the man in the expensive coat and his promise that trouble could disappear for the right price. The reaction from Daniel's circle came faster than I expected. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You've made a mistake. Some things should stay buried. No signature, no threats spelled out. Just the kind of message designed to slip under your skin." I forwarded it to Herrera without reply. 2 days later, Jenna showed up at Second Chapter with that stormlight in her eyes. "They're rattled," she said. "I've been hearing chatter, quiet moves, people lawyering up. And guess who's suddenly requested a prison meeting with you? I didn't have to guess. Daniel." She nodded. "Herrera thinks you should consider it. Not to negotiate, but to hear what he says. Sometimes cornered men give themselves away." A week later, I walked into the prison's visiting room. Daniel was already there, sitting at a bolted-down metal table, his prison uniform crisp, and his hair still combed like he was expecting a board meeting. "Claire," he said, smiling faintly as I sat across from him. "Daniel?" I replied, my voice flat. He leaned back, studying me. "You've been busy. I could say the same about you, but you've run out of places to hide." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "You think you've won. But you don't understand that file doesn't just hurt me. It hurts people with resources. People who don't care about the law. People like your friend in the expensive coat," I asked. He tilted his head. "So he came to see you?" I didn't answer. "Claire," he said, his tone suddenly serious, "you're safer letting it go. You hand that over and you've painted a target on your back for the rest of your life." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "You already put a target on my back the day you planted that necklace in my hands. The difference now is that I'm not running from it." For the first time, his smile slipped completely. Leaving the prison, I felt an odd calm. Daniel's warning wasn't empty, but it also wasn't new. He'd been trying to control my choices with fear since the day we met. Now that lever no longer worked. The next month was a blur of headlines. Whitmore associate indicted on fraud and racketeering charges. Federal investigation expands in wake of new evidence. The man in the expensive coat was named in one of the indictments. Victor, too. Daniel's name appeared in every article, usually followed by currently serving a 15-year sentence. Herrera called one afternoon to tell me the notebook had been the keystone piece. Without it, we might have gotten convictions on some of them, but not all. With it, they're falling like dominoes. I thought that would be the end of it, but late one evening, as I was closing up the store, I found an envelope slid under the front door. Inside was a single photograph me locking up the shop earlier that week. No note, no message, just a picture that said, "We're still watching." When I showed it to Herrera, she frowned. It's intimidation, nothing more. The people who mattered are going down. The ones left are grasping at whatever they can. It was meant to scare me. And maybe it would have once. But now it only confirmed that I'd made the right choice. By the time autumn settled over the city, the air in my life had shifted. The endless tension of looking over my shoulder was loosening its grip. The last of Daniel's allies were either indicted hiding or trying to negotiate their way out of prison time. The DA's office didn't need me in court anymore, but Herrera still called every couple of weeks with updates, and each time the news was better. Second chapter was starting to feel alive. The cafe corner smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee in the mornings, and the shelves were slowly filling with curated titles, many of them chosen based on conversations with customers. People came not just to buy books, but to talk some about what they were reading, others about their own stories of betrayal, survival, and starting over. I'd tell myself I wasn't there to offer advice, but more than once I caught myself leaning across the counter and saying, "You don't have to let what they did define you." And I meant it. Jenna still came by at least twice a week. Sometimes it was to bring me updates, other times just to sit in the corner with her laptop and drink espresso like she was claiming the place as her second office. One slow afternoon, she slid into the seat across from me. "Herrera says Daniel's filed an appeal." "Long shot, but you should know." I sipped my coffee. "Of course he has. He'll keep playing the game until there's no one left to listen." She studied me for a moment. "You don't seem rattled." "I'm not," I said honestly. "He's in a cage." "I'm not. That's all that matters now." That night, I closed up the store alone. The street was quiet, leaves skittering along the pavement in the wind. As I turned the key in the lock, I caught sight of movement across the street. For a moment, my chest tightened, but it was just a man walking his dog. Funny how even after the danger fades, your body remembers the fear. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Herrera. "The last of the charges against Daniel's associates have stuck. They're done." It should have felt like the final chapter, but life doesn't wrap itself in neat endings. There was no sudden rush of closure, no cinematic swell of relief. Just a quiet knowing it was over, or at least as over as it would ever be. I decided to mark the moment in my own way. That Saturday, I hosted an evening at the store. Stories of second chances. Customers and friends gathered, some reading from favorite books, others sharing personal stories. When it was my turn, I didn't read from a novel. I told them briefly about the lake house file, about turning it over, about the photograph under my door. I didn't give names. I didn't need to. I've learned, I said, that starting over isn't about erasing what happened. It's about deciding that what happened doesn't get the final word. The room was silent for a long moment, and then the applause came, warm, steady, unforced. A week later, an envelope arrived at the store. No return address. Inside was the same photograph of me locking up the shop. But someone had written across the bottom in black marker, "Good luck, Claire." This time, I didn't feel the sharp edge of threat. It felt more like surrender. I slipped the photo into the back of the ledger I kept under the counter, not as a warning, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. Jenna asked me once if I thought Daniel thought about me. Every day, I said. Not because he misses me, because he hates that I walked out of his story and started writing my own. The first real snow of the season came late that year, just a few days before the anniversary of my arrest. I stood at the window of second chapter that morning, watching the flakes drift down past the glass. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get in the moments before the city wakes up. I thought about where I'd been exactly 1 year ago, sitting in a cold holding cell, wondering how my life had ended up there, wondering if I'd ever walk out into the open air again. Back then, I'd believed I was at the end of something. I hadn't realized it was the beginning. The store was warm, the smell of coffee already curling through the air from the cafe corner. Teresa had stopped by early, bundled in her scarf to pick up a new collection of poetry. She hugged me on her way out, murmuring, "You're stronger than anyone should have to be, but I'm glad you are." Strength. It wasn't the kind I'd imagined when I was younger, bold, fearless, invulnerable. No, the strength I'd found was quieter. It was in the way I could look at my reflection now and not see only what Daniel had done to me. Sometimes customers recognized me from the news. A few would hesitate at the counter before finally asking, "Are you the Claire Whitmore?" I'd smile politely and say yes, though inside I always thought, "No, I'm not the woman you read about. I'm the one who survived her." I still got the occasional letter from Daniel. They came through the prison system, each one checked and logged before being passed along. Most went straight into a box I kept at the back of a closet unopened. Once curiosity got the better of me. The letter was exactly what I'd expected, half apology, half manipulation, threaded with that same mix of charm and venom he'd always used. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. The man in the expensive coat never returned. Sometimes I wondered if he'd been caught up in one of Herrera's final sweeps, or if he'd simply decided I wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Either way, his shadow had faded from my street. In the months after Daniel's conviction, people asked me over and over how I'd done it, how I'd managed to stand up to him, to survive the humiliation, the fear, the betrayal. The truth is, I didn't always feel like I'd managed it. There were nights I'd sat on my cot in the detention center and thought about giving in just to make the noise stop. There were mornings I'd woken up after my release and felt the weight of his voice in my head whispering that I'd never escape. But here I was. Not whole maybe, but still standing. And that was enough. One evening after closing, I stayed late to rearrange a display table. I switched the order of the books, adjusted the lamp so the light fell just right. When I was done, I stepped back and looked at it, at this small, warm place that existed, because I'd refused to let Daniel take everything from me. The sign above the door, second chapter, caught the glow of the streetlight outside. It had been the right name. Not just for the store, but for me. I locked up, pulled on my coat, and stepped out into the cold. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes catching in my hair. As I walked down the street, I thought about something Herrera had said to me after sentencing. Sometimes justice isn't about winning. It's about not letting them win. She was right. I hadn't set out to destroy Daniel. I'd set out to take back my life. And I had. If you've ever been betrayed like that, if someone you trusted tried to write the ending to your story without your consent, I want you to hear this. It's not over. You get to decide when the chapter closes. I did. And now, I'm living in the next one. If you've got your own story of starting over or of refusing to take the fall for someone else's sins, share it. Because telling the truth, even when it's hard, is how you make sure you're the one holding the pen. And if you want more stories like mine, subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't revenge at all, it's living in a life they can't touch.